Thanks for joining us. This is the first event of our Underwood Conservation District Winter Workshop series this year. And I'm Tova Tillinghast. I'm the director at Underwood Conservation District, and we just appreciate you taking the time to be with us, including those of you on Zoom. Tonight we'll be learning about wildfire in the Columbia Gorge and the important ways you can prepare for wildfire. We have Dan Richardson, UCD's Climate and Wildfire Resilience Coordinator, and Michael McNorvell, our new Wildfire Resilience Technician. So they'll be sharing insights, giving history around wildfire in the gorge and the growing concern around how to be prepared for wildfire. So we had a few years of online workshops here, and we're returning to the in-person events. Still need to get people retrained on in-person attendance, but we really are excited to try it both ways tonight with the online option. We'll have a great conversation. We'll save time for lots of questions and answers. If you're online, hopefully you're enjoying the benefits of being at home, and hopefully we'll get the best of both worlds tonight. So those of you in the room, you can use the restrooms through that side door. And those of you on Zoom, just a couple quick reminders to keep yourself muted through the presentation, and we'll actually stop for questions if you put them into the chat box. We'll definitely take a few questions during the presentation, and then we'll dedicate some time at the end for Q&A at the end. So if you have issues on Zoom, just put it in the chat and we'll try to address those. So this slide shows that we have a whole series set up for us this year. This is the first one, as I mentioned, and you can check out our website for news and events to see what else we have going on. But on our website, we have past workshops, and you can see the different topics that we've covered with those workshops. They've been recorded, just as this one is tonight, and they're archived on our website for future access. Of course, you can sign up for our newsletter to stay up to date on all of our activities. We'll keep you posted through our bi-monthly newsletter if you sign up for the newsletter. And then we have a plethora of information on our web, so please go check that out if you haven't already. Starting January 2nd, we'll have a native plant sale beginning, so that's exciting. We have pushed that date back from previous years, so January 2nd is the start date, and then March 23rd is our established Tree Fest date at this point, where all of those plant orders can be picked up. Right out here in the park is the plan for that. And we'll have a wide variety of community partners at Tree Fest, including Jeanette here, hopefully, and other activities, live music, and lots of fun at Tree Fest. So we'll hope to see you there. With that, I want to introduce our speakers. We have Dan Richardson, who has worked on several natural resource areas with Underwood CD for a dozen years. Including native plants, stream habitat, non-commercial forests, and wildfire resilience. And then after moving to the Pacific Northwest, Michael McNorvell was instantly enamored by the Cascade Mountains and earned a bachelor's degree in environmental science from University of Washington, studying forest ecology and natural resource management across Washington state. He received his master's in fire ecology from Colorado State University, where he studied how wildfire affects the relationship between above ground plants and below ground fungi. Michael just joined the UCD team in November and will be applying his knowledge of wildfire and local forests here in the Columbia Gorge and implementing techniques to build wildfire resilience with us in our communities. So I will let them take the reins here. Let's welcome Michael and Dan.
Thank you, Tova. I get to start us out. I have the privilege of starting us out here. Thank you to all the folks in the room here. You braved the atmospheric, extreme river, the bad weather to be here with us. So appreciate you guys, and also appreciate all the folks who are on Zoom as well. This is my first time to interface with community members directly in a significant way. And I get to sort of share some of the knowledge that I've gained over the years, share that with you all, and hopefully you find it helpful in some, at least small way. A little bit about us, Underwood Conservation District, some stuff that I just learned within the past few months, but I'm going to share with you all. We started back in 1940, among other conservation districts throughout the state, as a way to get knowledge to constituents, whether that's about forestry work, agricultural work, ranching and rangelands. Our job really is to be a repository for information for folks in the community. We're non-regulatory, not here to tell people what to do, unless they ask us, in which case we will happily give information about any sort of objectives having to do with conservation that people find helpful. This is where we are among the 40 plus conservation districts. We're one of the most southerly, just straddling the Columbia River here. We're almost straddling the Columbia River right before we get to Oregon. So from Swift Reservoir down to Skamania, over to Appleton, and then right here to White Salmon. If you live within this 1.4 million acres of covered land, about 2,000 square miles, and you have questions about how you can improve your conservation habits, questions about how to implement conservation techniques on your land, we've got you covered here. And we provide services just like these educational workshops that we're doing right now, but we also have other services such as, you know, invasive weed management, doing fish passage inventories and correction, oak woodland and forest management, which I think doesn't get enough credit. And we also have this incredible farm tool library that James in the back is actually heading up now. So in terms of tools, you can rent out tools from our farm tool library, implement any projects that you might want to, including fire resilience farm tools. If you're doing pile burning, we have water pumps, we have fire rakes, also pole saws here for pruning your trees if you're trying to improve the resilience of trees on your land, and also some planting shovels as well if you're doing some planting, which hopefully you might be. If you're here at this talk, we'll be getting into resilient landscapes. I think that's all the things I wanted to say there. Now getting into why you're here, Fire and Flora. This is a talk where we're gonna sort of start big picture, start with the ecology of the environment that we live in, and sort of continue to get smaller and smaller in scale to the landowner, the small parcel, less than an acre maybe, and ways that you and everybody else can improve your community-wide as well as your individual wildfire resilience in fire-prone areas like we have here in the Columbia Gorge. So a little bit about my background. I don't like to admit this readily, but I'm actually from Los Angeles, California, born and raised. And don't worry, I give myself enough grief about that fact for all of us. But growing up in California, obviously a really fire-prone environment, whether it's the Sierras, whether it's the low desert out there, lots of fires all the time. So my childhood was essentially spent with my summers looking at images like this, wildfire in our area. And these aren't relegated to any specific area. Like I said, these can be fires within urban metropolitan city limits. And they can also be fires that take out whole communities, like was the case with Paradise during the Camp Fire in 2018. So it's understandable then probably why I had an adversarial relationship with fire. I thought fire is bad. Fire is destructive. Fire kills trees, kills people, destroys property. How can this force of nature actually do some good? And it's not until I got 2 degrees in the subject when I started to ask myself, and I want to pose this question to you all here and at home, what is good fire? What does that mean? And even further, what does a fire resilient landscape look like to provide good fire? I actually want to open this up to anybody in the room. Any words on what a good fire might be?
There's a slow moving brush and grass fire in the right conditions. We'll talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the word control there. Is you don't want something that's out of control. That's it's low and slow and sort of moving at a controllable pace. Any other words on good fire?
So you can have some seed release.
Seed release, yeah. It's a really good one.
Low intensity and maybe more frequent.
Yeah,
So, big.
yeah, low intensity, maybe more frequent, and that's very much going to depend on where you are, which is going to be something that we get into here. So let's shift our view away from bad fire in California. We've grown up a little bit. We, meaning me, moved to the Pacific Northwest and started to learn about how fire has existed on the landscape for thousands of years, whether that's through natural processes exclusively. Not really. Tribes like the Yakima Nation of Tribes have been actually implementing fire as a cultural practice for thousands of years as well. This is to promote the growth of fire resilient plants like camas for camas root, or for huckleberry habitat, as well as to clear land for ungulates like elk and deer to come and graze and provide a source of food as well. But importantly, we have to think about this as the right fire in the right place. And this presentation, my bit of it will hopefully get into what that means. So I find it very helpful to visualize with easy imagery the way that fire functions as both an ecological and a physical process. And a really great way to do that is through what's called the fire triangle. And this is sort of a set of 3 subsetted triangles that describe different scales of how fire behaves and what fire looks like. So the first scale, we have the flame triangle, which really just answers the question, how does a fire start? How does fuel go from being just on the landscape to there being a flame that provides for the base of a fire? And there's 3 key ingredients that you need for a flame. You need oxygen, which thankfully is in abundance. Otherwise, we'd have much larger problems than dealing with wildfire. We need fuel, and that can be any and all vegetation, alive or dead. Anything that contains carbon that's on the landscape is a potential fuel. And then the last thing you need, a spark, an ignition. So that can look like natural ignition, lightning being one of the most common sources of natural ignition, probably the most common. Only other one you'd maybe see is magma, but again, thankfully, we're not dealing with lava flows all of the time down here. So really, when we talk about natural ignitions, we're talking about lightning strikes. And this is especially prevalent on the east side of Washington state. Whereas if we look at the west side of Washington state, we see far less lightning risk and far more human risk. So this can look like campfires that haven't been properly quenched. This can look like pile burns that get out of control. This can look like mischievous children in the forest with sparkling fireworks. And this can also look like sparks off of a train track, which was the case with the Tunnel 5 fire that happened very close to here early this year. And of course, you can see that, based on this burn severity metric, which is essentially just a way to quantify how much ecological effect a fire has had. Even though we see this unburned, low, moderate, not very high ecological impact, we still know that it had quite the impact in terms of property damage, in terms of its effect on the community. So just because there's a low, slow, not high intensity fire doesn't mean it's not going to have an effect on the community. Next scale, zooming out from a flame. Okay, you've got a flame on the landscape. Now, how does that flame then turn into a fire? And what affects the way that that fire behaves? There's 3 factors for that as well. There's the weather at the time that a fire is burning. There's the fuel, again, that exists on the landscape. Not only the type of fuel, but where the fuel is burning in terms of height and in terms of lateral direction. And there's also how dry that fuel is, how much moisture that an area has received at a given time. Has a lot to do with weather. Also, topography is a huge factor in affecting how a singular fire event behaves. So looking through some of that, water is the enemy of fire. So the wetter your conditions, the less likely a fire is, but as soon as you get a drought during the winter time, combine that with high, hot temperatures in the summertime, all you need is a spark. And that's far more likely for that fuel to actually combust and turn into a larger fire. And then the key, I think, for the Columbia Gorge and what makes fire really interesting to study out here is the inclusion of wind in that conversation. Wind does not only direct the way that fire moves, but also dries out fuel. It lowers the relative humidity of that fuel. So the more wind that you have, more likely you are that your fuel is going to catch. Like I said, really depends where your fuel is. So we sort of separate this into surface fuels, just what's ever on the forest floor. You've got your tree crowns here, and then in between your ladder fuels. Any sort of vegetation that can potentially take fire from the surface into the crown. And if folks know anything about fire, fire in the tree crown is a pretty surefire way, no pun intended, to kill your trees. Topography. So I think something that's really important for people to know is that fire moves uphill fast. Fire moves uphill fast. That the way that heat rises, we all know that heat rises, but that actually preheats fuel in front of a fire line and allows for that fuel to combust far more quickly than if it was on flat land or if you're looking downslope of that fire. We're also thinking about depressions, natural depressions in the landscape where moisture can accumulate. So again, water is the enemy of fire. So the more moist that fuel is within that depression, the less likely it is to burn, or at the very least, the less likely it is to burn at a higher intensity, completely combusting. We also think about fire breaks, both natural, like rivers, or like gaps in the canopy or gaps between vegetation. They can also be human-made, like roads or like trails. And then the last largest scale that we think about fire is at the regime scale. So this answers the question, how do fires behave in a given area over time? What's the pattern that we see with fires that burn in a particular area? And again, we've got vegetation, the type of vegetation, which is really driven by the climate that you experience in a particular area. So that climate vegetation ladder is pretty direct. And that climate can also affect the kinds of ignitions that you have. Like we talked about before, east side, far more likely to get a lightning caused ignition than on the west side. And that has to do with the climate that it experiences. And this is kind of what makes fire in the Central Columbia Gorge so interesting to study. It's that we sort of straddle the Cascade Crest and experience two different fire regimes. Not only do we have the low and slow frequent fires that we might get somewhere east of the Cascade Crest, somewhere over here, but we also get wet forests that are fed by a lot of precipitation, lots of vegetation growth, providing lots of fuel for fire. So thinking about this area, we're thinking sort of in and around Mount Adams, down in and around Mount Hood, sort of cutting this off at the Skamania County boundary, and then over to the east, the Klickitat River. So in that area between 2000 and 2022, we've experienced just over 325,000 acres of area burned in those 2 and a bit decades, with a frequency of about 1 to 2 a year. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that fire burns every single year. There's some years where no fires burn in this area, but then the next year and the year after that, there might be 2, 3, 4 fires that burn. Again, it depends on those weather, climatic conditions, as well as the other factors we talked about. And not only does it return pretty frequently, but it returns, or happen pretty frequently, but it returns pretty frequently as well. So areas that have burned before can actually overlap, just like over here in the Cougar Creek fire up in the northeast. And the average return interval for fires in this particular section of the Columbia Gorge is about every 7 years. So just because a fire has burned once in the last decade doesn't mean you don't have to worry about it anymore. It's burned once, you'll be fine for the foreseeable future. No, not the case. Forests burn and they burn frequently. And that means even here, that fire return interval is going to be pretty short. Just to further explain sort of this west-east divide, this is a very sort of arbitrarily drawn line to get at the midline of the cascade, what we call the cascade crest. And you can see over on the west side, that area is fed by Pacific storms, lots and lots of precipitation in the temperate rainforests of the Olympic Peninsula and some in the foothills of the West Cascades. You can get rain accumulation or precipitation accumulation as much as 180 inches in a single year. So lots of resources available for vegetation growth. Contrast that with the east side. By the time those storms have moved in, dropped all that rain, gotten to the Cascade crest, there's not a lot of moisture left over for the East Cascades. So generally tend to experience far less in terms of precipitation. Just move this over here. There we go. Now I can see my notes. In years past, historically, indigenous practices or natural ignition has been the case throughout the country. Right, and if we look at this National Risk Index for lightning strikes in particular, we can see that the Rockies, lots of lightning. Southeast, lots of lightning. In comparison, the Northwest, not as much risk of lightning, but of course it still does happen. And again, happens especially prevalent on the east side of the Cascades. So what does all this mean for the fire regime of these two different places? So on the west, cool, wet climate, lots of rain, lots of resources, lots of vegetation growth, lots of fuel. So even though this area doesn't get dry enough often to easily combust, it still happens, but it is pretty infrequent. The types of ignitions are mostly human caused, but you do get some lightning sometimes, but typically these ignitions are human caused on the west side. So what you get when you have all of these sort of infrequent factors overlapping is finally a fire, but it happens infrequently on the interval of maybe 400, maybe 800 years before fire returns to a particular forest. But all of that vegetation means that when fire does occur, it booms and it busts. It's really high intensity, really high severity, killing lots and lots of trees. The trademark West Side Forest, of course, Doug fir, Western hemlock. So for folks wondering at home, aside from the rain that you experience, how to tell what kind of forest that you're in, if you see Douglas fir and Western hemlock, maybe some vine maple like here, this is actually Cedar Flats Research Natural Area, which is in our district, just a little bit north of Carson, one of the most prolific stands of old growth forest. And it's right here in our backyard, which is pretty cool. But this is the trademark of the West Cascades and Western Washington. And you can see here, just because the typical severity is high severity, typically fire kills a lot of trees, that doesn't mean that there isn't some low severity patches. And this is especially true in places with larger trees that have thicker bark that can insulate themselves against lower intensity fires. So not always, but sometimes, depending on the conditions, as with all things forestry. And a great example of West Side fire is the Eagle Creek fire. So we had human ignition, a teenager or a group of teenagers with fireworks that started around Multnomah Falls. A great example of how wind-driven this fire was. It sort of petered around for a few days at a couple hundred, maybe a couple thousand acres of burning. And then the trademark Columbia Gorge winds that feel like they're going to rip your roof off of your house, but really it's just another Tuesday night in the gorge. Those came through and caused that fire to spread along what this would be a fire break, a natural fire break, but caused it to spread along and burned over 49,000 acres in total. And over a third of that was burned at high severity. So that's these big red swaths of trees, essentially saying that those forests, most, if not all of those trees were killed. And why does that happen? Well, again, super dense trees, really good chance of igniting the canopy, spreading from canopy to canopy within these trees. And typically this is your result. This is the result of a high intensity fire. a moonscape, as it was called to me when I first started doing this fire ecology work. So I guess the question is this a good fire? If you look just a few years after the fire, I think this is maybe 2 or 3 years after a high intensity fire. Here, this is the Norse Peak Fire of 2017. Well, there's green vegetation, there's mosses, all the trees are dead, but the understory is starting to thrive. So is it good fire? Not for me to answer, but for you to ponder. Contrast this with the East Cascades. Really hot, doesn't have the coast mediating those temperatures. So lots more dry fuels. Sorry about that. It's much drier, so not as many resources for vegetation to grow historically. So what you get is this open forest structure with, big trees that sort of pop out every so often, but lots of shrubs, lots of grass, lots of forbs built in there, lots of low-hanging vegetation. Most of these ignitions for these fires are natural, some human caused, some on purpose, some on accident. But because the conditions for fire, dry fuel, frequent ignitions, we get a frequent low severity fire regime historically. So yes, fire returns to the landscape pretty often, but usually there isn't enough fuel for it to burn at really high temperatures. So these trees end up doing just fine and surviving these fire events. Good indicator species that you're in an East Cascades forest, something like ponderosa pine, which has adapted to the frequent fire regime that we see in the East Cascades. So it has especially thick bark to shield its cambium from low to moderate temperatures in terms of fire. It also does this picture doesn't quite represent it well enough, but it does what's called self-pruning. So it gets rid of its fine branches, its needles on the lower end of the tree. That way there's nothing to carry fire up from the surface into the canopy. Doug fir also does this, even though it exists sort of west and east. This is also an adaptation that Doug fir has. Another tree you might see in the East Cascades is Gary oak, otherwise known as Oregon white oak. So these woodlands, again, you've got pretty continuous, but not necessarily dense greenery in the understory. And with oak, as well as other deciduous broad-leaved trees and plants, holds a lot of moisture. So it's really hard to burn, has a natural resistance because of the amount of water that's contained in just one of those things. So, in my opinion, this is kind of what good fire looks like in something like a ponderosa pine forest. So you have this open understory, continuous grasses, maybe some shrubs in the background there, nothing that grows too high. There was a low intensity fire, so you do see char on these tree stems. There is evidence that fire occurred, but ultimately they're still green. They're still happy, healthy trees. They had all the necessary conditions for them to survive that kind of fire. And so with this low intensity, pretty frequent fire regime, these ponderosas are doing just fine. So let's see if our East Cascade fire example actually follows what we've just talked about. So Cougar Creek fire back in 2015 burned in no small part on Yakima Nation land just east of Mount Adams. It was a lightning caused ignition, so natural ignition, burned about 52,000 acres, so pretty wide breadth of forest affected, but that's not necessarily unusual for an east side fire. Here's the tricky thing though. Again, we see that over a third of this area burned at high severity, which not necessarily something you'd predict based on the typical historic fire regime and forest structure on the east side. So what might have happened here? A couple things. Yeah, please let me know.
Disease
Mm-hmm.
and fire suppression,
Fire suppression. Yeah.
at least the last 8.
Yep. Yeah, about the last 2 centuries. Yeah, very good point. So around 1910, there was the big blow up, it was called. It was millions of acres that got burned in a single year back around 1910. Yeah, millions of acres burned in the West. lots of homes destroyed, many lives lost. And so the federal government was like, okay, can't let this happen anymore. We've got to protect our community members, protect our people. So they implemented the 10 a.m. policy, which essentially says if you see a fire one day, we want that fire out by 10 a.m. the next day. And so they employ these fire crews to go out, put out these fires, and it was a huge success, at least for what they were trying to achieve. So in terms of short-term objectives, yeah, you had less homes lost, less lives lost, other than, I want to asterisk this, with the folks who were actually fighting these fires. Lots of them died. No OSHA to protect them at that time. But then you get into the perhaps unintended long-term consequences. When you don't allow fire back into the system, you don't allow the fuel that is accumulating within that system to be removed, to burn up, be removed, to not contribute to the next fire. And so what you get, as well as more dense patches of trees, and this is especially problematic for the east side. West side, there's enough moisture that it's going to grow dense whether you like it or not. They're well fed out there, those trees. But on the east side especially, this is not typical, having such high tree densities, because shorter trees that would have otherwise been burned up in a low to moderate severity fire continued to grow for the next 20, 30 years until a fire came through again. Plenty of connected fuels from the surface to the canopy, plenty of big ponderosas being torched. So if they can't survive that, they can survive a lot, but even the most thick barked ponderosas can't survive a crown fire like that. And so what you end up with is, like in the Cougar Creek fire, big swaths of what would otherwise be perfectly healthy, happy trees being killed because of these densities, because of fire suppression ultimately. And as well, there's also a greater opportunity for fires to happen, especially in recent decades with changing climate. So not only do we have longer fire seasons, instead of being June through September, now we can go as early as April, go as late as November. Instead of there being plenty of precipitation in the winter months to sort of keep that fuel moist through the fire season and at least mitigate some of those hot, dry conditions. Now there's not enough moisture and more of that fuel has opportunity to burn. So now with that out of the way, what can we do? Now that we want to talk about what good fire is, what a fire resilient landscape looks like, that certainly isn't. So what can we do to provide the means for a fire resilient landscape, especially in the East Cascades, especially in dry, hot forests? Well, one thing we can do is mechanical thinning. That's where folks go in, take out every stem, every maybe 2 stems, and create the open park-like, savanna-like structures that these ponderosa pine forests or other dry forests are typically associated with. And this is great in terms of reducing density. What this can be problematic for is the accumulation of fuels on the forest floor. So the very operations of doing mechanical thinning can actually cause branches to drop, cause fuel to accumulate on the floor, so that even though you don't have necessarily these intermediate ladder fuels going up into the canopy, that fuel might still burn hot enough, the flame lengths might be high enough to burn the canopy and kill those trees. So thinning alone, not the most ideal solution. What you can do in conjunction with thinning is something like prescribed burning, which is when trained professionals go out early spring, late fall, when temperatures are low, when fuel moisture is higher than it would be during the typical summer fire season. And really the goal is to have a fire on the landscape to clear out these surface fuels, keep them from accumulating too high, and ultimately keep it from getting too big, too large, getting out of hand. So these two things in conjunction with one another aren't exclusive to federal lands, they're not exclusive to state lands, they're not exclusive to large tracts of land. This is something that conservation districts in our state have been experimenting with within the last year, 2 years, 5 years. This is something that the Mount Adams Prescribed Burn Association is trying to tackle as well. That's a local community organized prescription burn organization trying to use this method of removing fuels from the landscape. That way, when fire returns, because it's not a matter of if, but when, it looks a lot more like this and a lot less like this. Okay, but let's say that you're not looking at a whole community. You're looking at just your house, your property, your 1 to 2 acre parcel of land, and you are wondering, how do I make my landscape more resilient? How does my neighbor make their landscape more resilient individually? And combined, we provide a plethora of resilient landscapes for fire. Well, thankfully, Dan Richardson is here to take over for me and answer some of those questions. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Michael. Let's see. So this is the juncture in the talk where we go, as Michael said, from this sort of out there in the woods, policy level or community level conversation to sort of the home in the woods. And really my talk's going to be focused on folks that live out of town and then really into the edges of town. And depending on the communities and the community structure, that can be pretty far into city limits. All right, so communities that have really large wooded swaths inside the city limits, sometimes like Stevenson has big wooded lots, this advice would be useful for them too. And this is a graphic that shows essentially the home in the woods, and then this kind of this radius. And this is the area we're really going to be talking about tonight. This is what we call our defensible space area. So essentially it's the home and the yard. And first question people usually ask is, how far out is that? And the answer is that depends. Depends on how the condition of your property, how much time and energy you have, risk conditions, all sorts of things. But I like to say between 30 and 100 feet. Good. And here's some ideas about what people can do. And we're going to talk about these. And you can see there's this real difference between this disc and the sort of the out there, the back 40 or the woods, right? We're talking about defensible space, this disc, and out here is sort of the larger wooded landscape. The woods out back for a lot of people that have a few acres. It's not the focus of this talk, but there are an enormous number of resources for small forest landowners, small scale forest landowners. A number of different agencies have funds and programs, and too many to actually just sort of put into a slide. But if you want to reach out, email me, I can certainly share resources for small forest management. And briefly, what they all kind of drive at is how to go from these sort of dense stands. In our area, often they're old plantation stands, right? So an area that's been commercially harvested once upon a time, maybe replanted and or fire suppressed and grown really dense, and how to go from that to something that's maybe a little bit more open. So very briefly, my talk's not going to be about this, but it is worth getting some advice for that area outside the defensible space and really to drive towards a diversity of species and leafy species and kind of mixing it up and spacing them out. All right, onto the defensible space, the fundamentals. I like to start with some ideas that we're going to go through in a little bit more depth. First, it's the little things. Little things on and around the house tend to be what cause homes to be lost in wildfires. So little things are little readily ignitable weak spots, so to speak, in your defensible space. And I want to point out, it's not just a one weakness or one hazard to look for. It's look for these things that, because these risks they represent accumulate, they stack up, which also means you can reduce them bit by bit. Embers, it's not usually trees that burn down homes, properties, and communities in a wildfire. It's usually the embers that wildfires throw off. So really the hazards to people, to communities tend to be proximity to fire and wind-blown embers. When we're looking at our own properties and how to make them more resilient, how to make them more defendable against wildfire, and how to help the rest of our community and our firefighters defend them with us, it's really start at the house. The house is 0 feet out from the house. So in other words, on the house, and the first few feet is really critical area to work, and then to work outwards from there. And we call that centered zone defense. So you start at the house and then you work out to the yard, and then you work out to maybe the larger area outside that yard. And finally, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this. Vegetation obviously is something that people have a lot of control of in most of their landscaping, and there's no bad vegetation, there's no bad trees, but there are ways to make vegetation less fire prone and less of a fire risk. So we're going to talk about putting the right plants in the right places and then maintenance. So Michael did a great job talking about wildfire on a big scale, ecological scale, forest scale. That's really this out here, right? The big wall of flames out in the woods. For individuals, for homeowners, for small communities, it really becomes hazard as this is throwing off embers, sort of skipping into the community. Maybe it's a bunch of homes, maybe it skips homes. But this community area, or what we sometimes call the wildland urban interface, it's important to work out there. It's important to think about policy and ecology and working together. And we are increasingly, this conservation district and other agencies are increasingly trying to do that. And we'll be doing more of that with work in the coming year or years. But for individual homeowners, they don't have to wait for policy changes. They can really work on their own property in defensible space. So this is a picture from the Tunnel 5 fire. And I like that it illustrates kind of this dynamic in that there's fire around here. And it's lofting all these little embers towards communities. And then we're putting these resources to damp the fire here. We've got a plane dumping water. So most structures in most wildfires are lost from embers, right? These things. So we're talking about like flaming bits of bark, flaming pine cones. I like to tell homeowners, landowners, when we're having this conversation on their property, imagine taking a box of matches and lighting it and flicking the match at your property or at your home, which is an analog for an ember, right? And you will quickly spot where would you not put a match, especially on a hot, windy August evening in the gorge, and where is it just not that big of a deal? So risk is, with regard to wildfire, tends to be cumulative. And in this little line drawing, we've got these two neighbors. You can see they live out. They've got some trees and some shrubs, and it's probably a lovely place. And they have very similar risk. They have these little orange bricks, right? And those represent like a target, if you will, for embers or a wildfire risk. And you can see this one says firewood on the porch in the summertime, right? You put firewood on the porch tonight, not that big a deal. It's as wet as it can be. What about the leftover stuff? You leave it on the porch or you throw it under the deck, it's out of sight. That's definitely a target and a hazard for embers. Gutter debris that builds up in the summertime, very flammable. Certain species of plants that are flammable, like junipers and arborvitae, having a big wooden deck that's attached to the house, having unscreened openings like soffits. These are all little, in the big scheme of things, very small targets on your home or on your property, but they add up. So what if this bottom homeowner resident decided to take care of the soffits, right? And maybe when the deck got old, replaced it with stamped concrete or pavers or Trex or something. Maybe thinned out the junipers. You can see the risk is going down bit by bit. And that's essentially what we're talking about when we talk about improving defensible space. It doesn't necessarily mean, logging the property and pouring concrete over the acre around your house or something really dramatic like that. It means just being aware of readily ignitable things and reducing them over time. So what are those things? Remember, our goal is to reduce ignition risk from windblown embers, primarily. Big projects, roof, siding, fencing, deck, many wooden decks. If they're attached to houses, that is definitely a large wooden target that we want to be mindful of. And when the lifespan of the deck comes full circle, which they all do, it might be worth thinking about how to replace that with something that's less fire prone. These are really the big projects. The rest are modest landscaping skill work. So maybe hardscaping around the house, gravel, pavers, dirt, even just low green grass that you keep green during the summer. Screen any openings with a metal mesh. 1/8 inch diameter holes is kind of the standard recommendation. Under decks or soffits or vents in the house, on the top of the roof. Clean out the needles and leaves from your roofs and your gutters. Just once a summer. Traditionally around here, homeowners that clean gutters looked at it as a fall project. For me, it was the end of November, which has been the last of my neighbors' leaves blew into my gutters. And so I would do that as just sort of a maintenance project. But we really need to be mindful about maybe cleaning them out once in the summertime, to maybe the middle of summer, if they're accumulating pine needles and dead leaves. I do know somebody whose gutters caught fire from embers from a wildfire in the gorge. And so it's not just an academic idea. Turn the conifer lens back from the house. Conifers, evergreens, right? Christmas trees, things with needles and other much more flammable than most leafy things. And mow the tall grass. If you have a big field that's coming right up to the house, mow a perimeter. The first question being, how far is far enough? I don't know, some amount. Several passes of a lawnmower. You don't have to mow 2 or 3 acres of grass around the house to have lowered your risk, but having 20 feet of low cut, ideally green grass, is definitely going to help your survivability in a wildfire. And then these same things go for outbuildings that are close to the house. So a garage, a detached garage, a shed, an old barn. They're not only at risk from wildfire themselves, but if they do ignite there, then also a source of fire that's right next to you. Some things to do. Clean out the gutters. Again, summertime, pine needles, dead leaves. This fellow has a very lush backyard. You can see all the plants in the garden. It's lovely. So we're not talking about denuding the landscape of plants, right? We're talking about just maybe consider pushing them back. And you can put gravel, dirt, grass, pavers, anything that's not flammable. Think back to the matches. You could throw matches on the gravel all day long. It wouldn't cause any problems. Bark chips, however, or this bark moth will ignite. And these are ember ignitions from a fire. And Jack Cohen is one of the big names of wildfire research. And he says, look, it's the little things that ignite our communities. So little things close to the house. So the zone defense, the defensible space, start at the house and work out. So we've been talking about the house, right? Cleaning the needles off these angles where they build up, being mindful of what the deck is made of, and just basically wanting a really low ignition, a low ignitable area around the house. Not concrete, not denuded, not moonscape, just few readily ignitable sources on the house, and work outward from there. Here's a sort of before and after or side-by-side contrast. You can see these two folks, they may be neighbors, both have a lot of vegetation around their homes. This one has this continuous mass. You cannot imagine walking through here, right? There's no break. This person has spaced out vegetation, both away from the house, but also into clumps or islands in the yard. So the right plant, we'll talk about species, the right plants in the right place often comes back to the right place being just spaced out a bit, both vertically and horizontally. Let's talk about plants. So the right plant from a wildfire defense perspective, the ideal might be like, I think this is aloe vera. You are not going to ignite this plant, no matter how many embers you throw at it. So that's a great plant, right? Obviously, we want to have a wider palette on our landscape than aloe vera, but it's a key idea to remember. Plants that don't readily ignite should predominate close to our homes. What's a right plant? I'm going to come at this sort of around the long way. This is not the right plant. It's very common. It's probably the most, I read somewhere, it's the most widely distributed plant in the world. It's juniper, so I think this is the Western juniper or common juniper. It's extraordinarily flammable. It's also, as we know, a great landscaping plant in the sense that if you put this anywhere near dirt, it will grow and grow forever. It's bulletproof. You can't kill this stuff. And there's no maintenance, right? It is what it is. It's juniper. It's there forever. You're done. Which has benefits, right? There's value to that. A low maintenance landscape. There you go. It's also extraordinarily fine, very dry, very resinous, and it's a conifer. The needles are small, but it's a conifer, which means it's very flammable. And there's a juniper bush that went up in this wildfire. I can think of, I'm sure this is not an exhaustive list, but I can think of in the last 5 or 6 years, patches of junipers that have gone up in flames around the gorge that were separated from anything else, or when nothing else lit up. So twice in the Dells, once in Underwood. So it's really flammable. And if we want to be mindful of our own property and want to adapt to a fire-prone landscape, then we need to have fewer of these things close to the house. Blackberries too. You can tell this is a greened up grass, so it's a kind of a damp time of year in the Eastern Gorge. Blackberries burn great. You get them started, and they're green, right? They're tall green bramble. You might think, well, they're very lush and leafy, but their stems, of course, are very small and fine, and much of the plant is either dead or dry most of the time. So for our neighbors in Central and Western Skamania County, many of whom grow great patches of blackberries, probably not on purpose. It's something to be mindful of close to the house. All right, right plants. So the right plants with regard to wildfire hazard simply are harder to ignite. That's what it comes down to. They tend to be plants like this lovely big leaf maple. Leafy, so as Michael suggested with oaks, they tend to hold more water and sort of less resinous, easily ignitable. They're just less easily ignitable plants. That's why they make great firewood, right? They burn slower, longer, rather than sort of fast and hot like a pine. One thing that's true about most of our leafy species, especially our native ones, is they tend to respond well to pruning. You are unlikely to kill, even if you prune badly, you're unlikely to outright kill a leafy plant, a native leafy plant. And I propose that native species ought to be ones that you really prefer or have a bias towards in your landscaping. And that's more of an ethical argument than a wildfire argument, because cumulatively, our built up environment, our yards, our backyards, take up an increasing amount of space on the landscape. And we increasingly, just as we proliferate, chop up habitats with our own habitats, with our own living spaces. And one way we can sort of buffer the impacts on the natural world are to make sure that we keep or plant native species. So I'm thinking about things like maples, right? There's 100+ species of maples. 3 are native to this area. Whether you go with native or non-native, they're going to be a low fire hazard plant, not a no fire hazard, but a low fire hazard. Same with oaks, dogwoods, fruit trees, native shrubs, again, leafy things are great to add or have a bias for in your defensible space landscape. This is obviously a bit of a shock. This was Lahaina, Hawaii, which burned down this summer. And I keep this here just to remind me, it's not just about each individual piece of property. It's also about all of them working together, but also because, again, this place is not heavily forested. It's grass. Grass is easily ignitable, moves quickly, and in this case, it was wind in proximity that caused such a catastrophic effect. And wildfires are also kind of patchy. They will skip areas, right? So the wind blew right past this neighborhood and then burned these around it. And then there's this compound, which does have a lot of trees, but also a lot of concrete and impervious surfaces. And it skipped right around that. So wildfires tend to be, as Michael showed with some of his maps, a mix of severities, right? Even the most destructive have only 30%, 40% high severity on the landscape. When they get into communities, they can have a much higher percentage of severity, however, because these homes are built of a lot of carbon, right? With a lot of wood and a lot of oil, plastics and such. So again, it's not grass or it's not trees necessarily. It's wind, it's embers, it's proximity that we're really trying to be mindful. All right. What's the right place for a plant? So you've been thinking a little bit about what's the right plant. Something that doesn't burst into flame when it gets hit with an ember. Something like this lovely Oregon grape, which is has the benefit of being evergreen and one of the first things to bloom in the springtime. So it is sort of an extra benefit to early emerging pollinators. Where do you put these? How do you think about plants on the landscape around the house? Well, we're given this sort of aesthetic that if you have a house, it should be like surrounded by a mass of shrubs, right? This is just something cultural. So I want to make the particular point that if you're going to have foundational shrubs, low and leafy is kind of the way to go with regard to wildfire hazard. So Oregon grape, we have a lot of native currants, mock oranges, all sorts of native leafy species to pick from that are lovely and well adapted. They don't have to be native. There are other shrubs that are common, laurels and photinias and other things that are evergreen, low fire hazard. So there are lots of options. These are all leafy species, not conifers. So when you're next to the house, I encourage people to give their shrubs, their plantings, give them space. So if you have a house, even if it has a conifer 5 feet away, you know, the incense cedar that grandma planted, okay, there are more than one way to look at landscape, and an emotional attachment is a real thing, but you don't have to jam it up with other conifers. You can give it some space. You can put hardscaping around your shrubs and your foundational shrubs. You can have a mix. As you move farther out in your yard, the goal for a low fire landscape tends to be park-like. So that's a good description, much like the images that Michael showed at the resilient forest. And that means separating tree canopies out in that 30 to 100 feet area from homes. Not every single tree has to be completely isolated. You could have 2 or 3 together. You have clumps or islands, but you don't want a solid acre or 2 acres of really dense conifer trees, especially small diameter ones right up to the house. You want to separate them out. You want to be mindful about getting in and out of the driveway. If you have a long driveway, I would say the longer, more sinuous, steeper, and harder to navigate the driveway, the more important it is to keep it brushed out. And our first responders say something like 12 feet wide, 15 feet high for clearing brush around these harder to navigate driveways so we can get fire engines in and out. And finally, proximity to your house and to your outbuilding. Proximity really is as important as species, right? So I dump all the junipers because they're super flammable. But really, if you had a couple out along, the edge of the property 100 feet away, it's not that big of a fire risk. A couple of them right on top of the house is a much bigger fire risk. So really, proximity or placement is really important. And finally, we can talk about right plants, right places or spaces. In the third leg of this sort of vegetation triangle, if you will, right plants, right places, maintenance. And much like this scene, which is not uncommon in Skamania County, you roll up to this is not a particular piece of property. It just happens to have been a picture that I collected somewhere along the way, but it could have been any of 100 places. You roll up and you see the blackberries overtaking the truck and the barn, the tall grass coming right up to it. It's like, yeah, okay. Things grow really fast in the Central Gorge and on the west side of the gorge. Look, they just do. That's why we need to be sort of consistent with our maintenance, especially around the house and the outbuildings, right? So what does that mean? It means obviously cutting the grass, cutting the field, breaking back dead leaves, pruning blackberries, cleaning gutters, things we've been talking about. Some basic maintenance around the house. If you have a property and it's overrun with blackberries, I'm not saying you have to clear an acre's worth, but maybe back from the shed, back from the barn, back from the house. All right, maintenance. And I argue that maintenance might well be as important as right plants in the right places. So even if you take my preference to heart and dig out all your junipers and put in mock oranges and red currants and Oregon grape, which is like just as hardy as juniper, and you let the dead leaves collect under your wooden deck over the years, that's still a problem, right? The maintenance is just as important as the plant selection and the spacing. So let's just think about this for just a moment with this handsome line drawing. What a lovely scene. You've got a beautiful house, and it's this like lovely wooded setting where the vegetation, these are shrubs, is less than, it's less than 0 feet from the house, is overhanging the house. First of all, it's going to make maintenance kind of a nightmare, as your gutters and your foundations and whatnot. But it's also obviously increased fire risk, because if embers ignite anything here, it's right on top of the house. It's hard for people to see the house, firefighters to get to it, etc. Just more targets right around the house. Not ideal. So this is not a moral issue. At least I'm making the case that this is not a moral issue, how flame prone or flame resistant your house is, right? It's really a matter of risk awareness and adaptability. And I suggest that people would do well and really ought to adapt to an increasingly fire prone environment. But it's not a wrong, it's not bad. It's just sort of not ideal from a fire adaptability standpoint. So we don't have to feel bad, we should just be aware. So what if this fellow spaced things out? He still has his house. You can see he took out one tree. You can see the woods in the background. He's got shrubs, but they're spaced out somewhat. All right, better, right? So it's not a black and white. It's stacks of risk. It's those bricks of risk that accumulate and the choices we make to remove some of those. And here's the same house with a lot more clearance. Some shrubs, maybe they're heirloom shrubs. You couldn't bear to part with them. But has put this gravel around the house. Here's like a paver patio. Yeah, pretty good. Much harder for this place to light up during a wildfire. Even if the flames were intruding, it would be hard for that house to, or much harder for it to be lost. Here's a real world example. We see this a lot, especially in the central and western part of the gorge. Super, super dense stands of Doug fir, sometimes planted, like a replanted plantation. Sometimes just in these disturbed areas along driveways, where there's been a road cut, and then a lot of plants have seeded in. There's a house back here, right? So they did some work. cut this back. How? It's better. It's not ideal. It's better. So they've tipped the risk, or sort of say, turn the dial of risk down, right? They could still do more. You know, maybe this really dense patch of trees, small diameter, kind of baby trees right next to the house. Maybe that could be thinned out. Maybe some more thinning here, because all these canopies are still growing together, right? Maybe taking some out and adding diversity. Some maple trees, some dogwood, some bitter cherry, some other native leafy species here would make this a much more defensible space. Okay, here's the participatory portion of my talk tonight. Keep track of your own scores. There are no prizes, but there should be sort of pride if you score high. All right. Which one of the following is the higher ignition hazard? So ask yourself, you're a homeowner and I come up and we're going to walk around and there's a dying fir tree in the yard. It's got red needles, a lot of it, maybe it's been dying for the past year or two. There's a snag tree out in the woods, several hundred feet away that's bothering you. These are real world examples. These are real world conversations. Which of these, not which one is like stuck in your crop. That's an aesthetic question. I don't like snags. We could talk about snags. They're great, especially out in the woods. But in fact, what we're trying to really focus on are what are ignition hazards. The dying fir tree. It's conifer. It's unhealthy. It's close to the house. Right? Okay, let's try another one. Juniper's Oregon grape. Michael, which one? They're both evergreen. They both are bulletproof plants, right? Junipers, yes, more fire prone. I'm not saying it's terrible. I'm not saying you're a bad person if you have these. I'm saying be mindful where they are, right? All right, here's a trick question. Deck furniture, metal deck furniture, or foam or wood deck furniture? Turns out foam deck furniture is incredibly flammable. Yeah. Someone, again, it's not a good or bad. It's not moral or immoral. It's less flammable, more flammable. But you say, I really want comfortable and I want foam deck furniture. And it's my choice. I would say, yes, it is. Free country. Knock yourself out. So how do you can just live with it? I've decided that the risk is so low that I'm not going to worry about it. Okay. Then you've done that on purpose. But you could have your foam deck furniture, and if you leave for a week during the summertime, or if you get evacuated for wildfire, then you just throw it off the deck away from the house. It's proximity, right? You can have the most flammable stuff next to your house in the wintertime and probably be at very low risk. In the summertime, you want to give yourself some defensive space. You want to move that stuff away. All right, firewood on the porch in the summertime. And Michael, taking the remnant firewood and throwing it under the deck in the summertime, just as bad. So, okay. Or the downed log. Should I be cleaning up my forest? All right, that's a pretty common question. It's a real tangle back there. Well, maybe. But what's the higher ignition hazard? Yeah, firewood on the porch or under the deck. All right, bark chips. I love bark chips. I have a yard full of bark chips. Bark chips in the garden, a little bit away from the house. Bark chips that are just like an ocean of bark chips, like just rolling up and surrounding your house and your wood deck, right? It's about proximity. So the right plant and the right plant material depends in a great degree on the proximity. I have taken this to heart at my own property. So this is not just good for you, it's also good for me. And I've started replacing the many pockets of dry bark chips I had in various plantings around my house with pond rock. With what? Like a pond rock, like a big round, like landscaping rock. And it's not that big a hassle. It takes a few hours. All right, last one. Your neighbor's conifer hedge 200 feet away, or your tall grass field 10 feet away. All right. Flashy, easily ignitable, close to the house. I hope most of you got a pretty high score. Okay, we're just about at the end here. This is a lovely view of the gorge. This house has some defensible space on top of Underwood. And you can see the various species that scorched here this summer during the Tunnel 5 fire. These plants are low, they're green, they're well watered. Bark chips right there on purpose. This person said, I love bark chip mulch. I know, but I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna keep them watered. That's okay. I didn't give her any guff about it. That was her choice. But having this open space, this sort of defined open space, meant that firefighters could do their work here and really help. It turns out save these properties. Not every property was saved, but more were saved than lost, even when fire got right up, like literally right up to the deck. So in summary, wildfire, it's both a community and an individual hazard or problem. Our individual actions are effective in lowering risk. Little choices around our homes accumulate. We can either dial up the risk or stack up the risk, if you will, or reduce the pile of risk. And I want to encourage people to think that when they get out, they get excited, it's March and it's time to get outdoors, maybe do some gardening, spring cleaning. I want you to be mindful that this is also wildfire cleaning. Walk around your property, take a look once a year. See if there are things that are readily ignitable that you might change bit by bit or maintain. So spring cleaning should have wildfire on mind. And as climate change makes our seasonal patterns more erratic, these two things are going to become more and more synonymous. And I just like this quote from columnist Eugene Robinson: climate change is personal, act accordingly. And this was, I added that a little bit. I don't know if you can tell. Wildfire is personal, act accordingly. And that is us. This website here, and not us, but we'll have many of the same kinds of things that I've been talking about tonight. So if you're like, what should I do again? You can go here. You can go to our website, ucdwalk.org. You can email us, fire@ucdwalk.org. And we're going to have a pretty robust wildfire resilience program in the next couple of years. And it's going to include a number of these elements, home evaluations, forest stewardship. If you have a neighborhood project, let's talk about that. All sorts of things, even prescribed burning. And if you have not heard, or it's not in the chat yet, I'm not quite sure, but there is a prescribed burning association just getting started. And the meeting is the 11th next week, 6 p.m., the White Salmon Fire Station. And I'm told there's going to be refreshments, so come hungry. And we just want to get the right plants to plant. There are a number of places. One of them is through us, UCD. It's not like we make a killing on this. It's a service, but it's a good service. And you can order online starting January 2nd. Thank you for your attention this evening. Thanks, folks on Zoom, for joining in. Any questions? Yes. Man,
Where should all that firewood go?
where should your firewood go? In the summertime, it should go 30 to 100 feet away from your house and covered. Because most people accumulate more firewood than they use in any one season, right? Stack. The same goes for lumber pieces. Project debris, if you do any woodworking or have done any thing where you accumulate offcuts of wood or small ignitable stuff, ideally covered in a shed or even like with a tarp, right? Something that will resist catching embers. Any other questions? Mr. Jeff, oh, please. That's our siding.
Like the differences between the different siding options.
Basically, flammable and not flammable. Most siding is mostly flame resistant. Some is more, like the hardy board is going to be more than maybe the old traditional siding. Look, wood shake siding flammable. Board and bat probably slightly less flammable than like the wood shingles. You don't see a lot of that around here, a little bit. And I guess that's the exception to the rule that it's the little things that stack up, because siding is obviously a big thing. It's a big project. But those things have a lifespan. I would propose when time comes to replace it, that's when people replace it with something that's not a wood siding or a wood shingle roof. Yeah. Mr. Joe.
I was at the High Desert Museum this summer. And
Yeah.
I saw that pine forest by burn demonstration project. It was really impressive, but one thing I learned was that the pine forests used to be these big trees, and
Yeah.
they were all harvested. And now, you know, even the older growth pine forests, they're still not huge because they take many years to grow to be that big.
Yeah.
Is that something that could be affecting the severity of fire that we have now? We used to have these huge trees in our forests.
Yeah, so some of the research that I've done as a fire ecologist and scientist has said that yes, species is important for its fire resistance. But probably the more important factor in resisting fire is size, because that's directly proportional to how thick that bark is going to be and how much insulation that tree has to a low severity fire, a moderate severity fire, even some high severity fires or high intensity fires. So, you know, the two ways that a tree will die is either through direct heat death that kills off the cambium inside the tree, or the crown catches fire and now it's got nothing left to photosynthesize with. So yes, the dearth of larger trees, larger ponderosa pine trees, but also larger Doug firs, larger western hemlocks, larger noble firs on the west side of the Cascades, both contribute to higher mortality rates when fires come through. Yeah. Yeah.
Don't know that this is a question as much as something that I've been kind of grappling with.
Let's talk.
The whole concept of like defensible space and fire breaks. I always feel like that assumes that fire is moving horizontally across the landscape. And here, as was the case with the Eagle Creek fire, where we had spotting 7 miles away across the Columbia, you know, where wind is such a big factor. I'm like, does it really make sense to, you know, park out your property for a distance around your house when embers are coming from miles away and coming down onto your property instead of across? So just kind of a provocative question, I guess.
No, it's a great point, and I will agree and reinforce that. I mean, look, most people are not going to be in the path of embers or wildfire in any given year, or even any given decade. Right? It's a big landscape out there, but more people will, and more people are. I've lived in my own house for 19 years in the age of the house and never had any. And it's very dry and haven't had any problems except for the last couple of years. And now we've had wildfires, like small fires, fortunately, but two right back to back, just increasing number of people, increasing number of ignition points, increasingly, you know, longer erratic fire seasons. So to your point, it doesn't make sense to like park out the whole, like on a landscape scale. Maybe, maybe not, but I would make the case that there's prudence for individuals to be mindful of their own little corner of the world, their own home, their own yard. And if you own 10 acres, you don't necessarily need to park out 10 acres, but maybe be mindful of that half acre. Yeah. In part because most of the people responding, at least the initial response to wildfires in most places, are volunteers, they're neighbors. Right? And if you live in downtown White Sand, downtown Stevenson, you know, really more urban environments is just not that big a deal because you're 25 feet from the road, the fire trucks will park in your front yard. But if we're out a little bit, and especially the harder it is to access a place, I would say the more prudent it is for people to be mindful of that. Yeah.
I agree with you that, out in the woods somewhere, the first half acre around the house is the most important. But if you spend a little time, do some work on the larger piece of property, even if an ember comes in, it starts with your property, it's not coming across from somebody else's.
Yeah.
The intensity of that fire is going to be lower, and the chance that it's going to go crazy and jump up to the ground is much reduced.
Yeah.
Yes. So with finite amount of time, money, energy, capacity, where should we prioritize as residents working? I make the case that pretty consistent, pretty thorough research shows that it's at the house and in the yard. And we got that squared away, then move out into the woods a bit. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, we do a little bit of time.
And that's why, even though this talk was not about sort of the backyard of forestry, I had a bit in there, a slide or two, encouraging people to think about that as well, if you have a few acres. And it's almost two conversations. One is like, nail the defensible space for wildfire hazard and related things. And then if you have that, let's talk. Because there are a lot of resources to be brought to bear on that. And it's a very worthwhile conversation. It might not be exactly the same. Yeah.
Basically, you're looking at landscaping around the house and ladder fields.
Yeah.
Potential.
Flat.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Disrupting even that horizontal continuity can be really important, can be the difference between having a house and not. You know, even if these ignitions are coming from windblown embers, as you were saying, the way that fire can then spread on from that ember will have a lot to do with what your landscape looks like. Yeah, so I'd say it goes back to Dan's point about turning the dial. You know, we're part of this system, whether we like it or not. Even though we like to control our environment in a lot of ways, the one thing that we're not going to be able to control is just the power and magnitude of something like wildfire. We can turn the dial. We can reduce the risk as much as possible, and we can sort of coalesce the human world with the rest of the world in a way that's like, you know, we are part of this community, whether that's a community of people or a community of plants and people and animals and all the things.
I think there's opportunity to, I stress the native species, right? Because I think they're appropriate. And I do think there's an ethical argument to be made that in our little corner of the world, whether that's a third of an acre or 30 acres, that we should be mindful of our impact and how we can buffer negative impacts. And one of those ways is keeping healthy native plant communities, diverse plant communities, connected plant communities, which will also often reduce wildfire hazard. So I think there's sort of multiple layers of good. And I do, Jeanette, try to come at this conversation with people with a really calm approach, right? There are some people that I've heard, I'm not going to name any other agencies, but I have heard you've got to scare them into action. I don't accept that. I want to encourage people into action. And if we can do that, then just like the reducing the little bricks of fire risk around an individual home can reduce that home's ignitability, as more people have less fire-prone homes, you kind of do that on a community scale. You reduce the sort of ignitability of homes around a community, and someday we're going to have community scale fire. I think we had a couple of close calls this year, actually. I think Underwood could have been more. I mean, we lost half a dozen homes despite this remarkable amount of resources put into holding a fire, like half a dozen aircraft, right? It just people, and still lost them, right? And it bumped up over the top of the bluff at one point, and they got hold of it. But had they not, had it been a little windier, conditions, maybe not as many resources available at the time, it could have gotten into a more densely packed neighborhood. And there was one, I don't have a picture of it. Michael's probably tired of me giving this example, but there was a community on the east end of the gorge, a mobile home community. So people with many fewer resources and means than Underwood. And they came within a whisker of like losing 100 of these places all at once, surrounded by lots of juniper and coniferous landscaping. And I don't quite know how they managed to do it, except the firefighters got there, and so it was a very close call. A couple of units got burned up, and then they managed to somehow defend the rest. So I think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see community scale destruction. I think we've just dodged a bullet. But the more, it's sort of a numbers game, right? The more leafy material and Oregon grape and less juniper on the landscape, the more people have made a few landscaping decisions and sort of adjusted or adapted themselves to a fire-prone landscape. Maybe that will buffer the destruction that could happen. You know,
that's a plug for us, right? Like that's what we're trying to do is get these community scale projects going, whether that's, you know, we go in with community leaders, or, you know, we work with individual landowners who together comprise an environment, a community.
We might need to do a better job about strategically emphasizing the defensible space too, right? Not all homes are equal risk. And so that's something we're trying to be mindful of. But we broadcast the word to one and all. We may do well to really emphasize this in a sort of more strategic fashion. And I will say, just for interest, Google the Lahaina home that survived the wildfire. There's, I think, a New York Times article about it. And one of those fires in that like gray, you know, destructed zone, blasted zone, survived wildfire. They're like, now who knows why? It could have been this, could have been that, could have been the fact that they had like totally redone their landscaping, just coincidentally, and taken it from like overgrown, really flammable to like more rocks and stuff. Yeah.
You have to see that picture of the one home in Underwood. One of the block homes, and it had a couch on the porch. And it had a roof on it.
It was a foam couch. That's my slide, just in case I don't. Foam. It got scorched, but there were firefighters nearby.
Plus a self-watering system.
He had an amazing self-watering system. So the house was like, as I wasn't there, but had it described to me, the house was like, the outside was like running with water. There's enormous fire nearby. It was a Doug fir, I think, stand that was totally engulfed. The house was totally wetted down, but you could see this covered deck was not wet, and this couch caught an ember. It's the little things close to the house.
Yeah.
And thanks to that landowner for
Thank you.
So yes, thanks to this gentleman for sharing and being willing to share his tale.
Before we hop off, was there anybody asking questions in Zoom or anything? Okay, no worries. Just want to make sure we give those folks attention.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Michael and Dan, for the excellent presentation, and we appreciate your time and attention tonight. Thanks to you guys who stuck with us on Zoom. And we will have this presentation on our website to watch later. So if you have a neighbor or someone that should have been here tonight, please pass it along. Check our website soon. And then we have the rest of our winter workshop series. So please check that out and attend those as well in January and February. So again, thank you for joining us and happy holidays.